You're standing somewhere you worked years to reach. Maybe it's a stage with a microphone going warm in your hand. Maybe it's a conference room where every face just turned toward you at once. Maybe it's your desk, the morning after, the promotion, the acceptance, the thing you told yourself would finally feel like enough. Someone is saying your name like it carries weight. The room believes it. Your first thought isn't pride. Your first thought is, they have the wrong person. Not as performance. Not as false modesty you trot out at the right moment. You actually scan the space, for the real one, the prepared one, the version of you that actually deserves to be standing here. Because the person in this body doesn't feel like them. The applause lands somewhere just outside your skin. You smile. You say thank you. You hold your posture exactly the way a certain person would. And quietly, underneath all of it, you start counting the days until they figure it out. Here's what makes this feeling impossible to reason with: the more you accomplish, the louder it gets. Not softer. Louder. As if success doesn't quiet the suspicion, it just gives it more to work with. This feeling has a very specific address. It doesn't live in people who coasted. It doesn't show up in people who cut corners and got lucky and know it. It lives, almost exclusively, in the ones who prepared the most, cared the most, lost the most sleep, and still cannot shake the sense that something about where they've landed is fundamentally unearned. The strange part is that the evidence doesn't touch it. You can recite your accomplishments. You can list the years, the work, the proof. Your brain will listen politely, and then return to what it already decided. Because this isn't really about confidence. It isn't about self-esteem in the way that word usually gets used. It's about a specific fracture, between what the world can see about you and what you believe about yourself. And that fracture formed long before you had a career, a title, or anything worth feeling like a fraud about. Two psychologists first put a name to this in 1978, the same year the self-help industry was just learning to call things by names, still cataloging what it had been watching in high-achieving women for years. They named it. Published it. And almost nobody who has it believes it applies to them. Your brain runs two parallel accounting systems. They have never been reconciled. The first is external. The degree. The title. The salary. The room that turns when you walk in. These things exist outside your body, they can be photographed, pointed to, measured. They don't shift based on how you slept. The second is internal. It runs on a different currency entirely, a standard you absorbed somewhere early. Not from a manual. Not from a single conversation. From pattern matching in your childhood environment. A standard for what enough actually looks like. For what earns safety. For what, finally, would justify the space you take up. For people who carry this weight, that internal standard is almost always calibrated above anything external achievement can reach. The degree wasn't from the right place. The promotion came before you were truly ready. The award was given by people who didn't know enough about your weaknesses to make a fair call. Your brain is less like a fair judge and more like a referee who only blows the whistle in one direction. Every goal you score, reviewed, contextualized, attributed elsewhere. Every goal scored against you, recorded and final. The ledger is real. You built it yourself. And you've been maintaining it for years without quite realizing that's what you were doing. A psychologist who spent years studying Nobel laureates described one winner, decades into a career of genuine, documented mastery, who woke the morning of the ceremony and sat at the edge of her hotel bed, convinced the committee had confused her name with someone else's. She'd rehearsed her field's foundational questions in the dark. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there, going through the logic of how a mistake like that could happen. 30 years of work. And the feeling hadn't left. It had just learned to speak in a more educated accent. No achievement had been large enough to file under proof. And there's a reason for that, one that goes back further than her career, further than yours. The committee didn't make a mistake. But somewhere, a long time ago, something else did. This didn't begin in a boardroom. Think back further than your first job, your first public failure, your first moment of professional doubt. Think back to the first time someone placed a condition, even a subtle one, even an invisible one, on your worth. Here's the version that gets talked about, the critical parent, the impossible standard, the constant you could do better. That story is real. But there's a quieter version, less told, just as formative, and it happens in perfectly loving homes. Imagine dinner. You've come home with an A+. The table is warm. Your parents ask questions, they lean in, the conversation lights up, you can feel it, the way a room has a temperature and yours just rose. A month later you bring home an A-. Nobody criticizes you. Nobody says anything unkind. There's care, there's consistency, there's love. But the room is a few degrees cooler. A silence where the questions used to be. You don't register that as cruelty. You register it as data. And the conclusion you draw, with complete logical coherence, given the evidence available to a child, is this: love is stable, but warmth tracks performance. I am loved no matter what. But I am celebrated when I deliver. And somewhere between those two things, a rule gets built. You are only as safe as your last result. Children are extraordinary architects of internal rules. They build with precision and no awareness that they're building. The problem is they construct those frameworks with incomplete data, inside rooms with very specific conditions, and then carry them forward into every room that follows, regardless of whether the conditions still apply. You grew up. You accumulated evidence. You built a life that objectively contradicts the rule. The rule came with you anyway. It lives below the level where evidence gets processed. Your brain isn't measuring you against your resume. It's still measuring you against that table. Here's the cruelty that doesn't get enough attention. The more capable you become, the more clearly you can see the precise shape of everything you don't know. Real skill comes with an increasingly detailed map of your own limitations. There's a pattern researchers have described in high-stakes meetings: the most qualified person in the room often goes quiet right before a decision, while the newest hire speaks with total certainty. No one calls it out. It looks, from the outside, like deference. But it's something more structural. The most dangerous voice in any room is the one that hasn't yet discovered what it doesn't know. It has no idea there's anything to be uncertain about. That's why inexperience can sound like confidence. It hasn't yet mapped the territory where confidence breaks down. You've done the opposite. You know exactly where your knowledge ends. You can track the precise moment in any conversation where your certainty runs out. You've mapped the edges of your own incompetence with a level of detail that nobody asking you questions has access to, while they experience only the surface. Your brain is less like a fair judge and more like a referee who only blows the whistle in one direction. Every goal you score, reviewed. Every goal scored against you, recorded and final. And here's where it closes the loop. Someone sends you a compliment, a real one, specific, from someone whose opinion you respect. You read it twice. You feel something for about 4 seconds. Then your brain files it under they don't have the full picture and moves on. The email sits in your inbox. You never quite delete it. You never quite believe it either. That's not modesty. That's a ledger that only runs one way. So you cope. Everyone copes. Some people overprepare. They arrive at the meeting having read everything, rehearsed answers to questions that will never come, anticipated every possible point of failure, because being caught unprepared would feel like confirmation. So they work twice as hard as anyone else in the room. And when it goes well, the brain files it correctly: of course it went well, I prepared obsessively. Which means they can never stop preparing obsessively. Stopping would be the experiment that finally proves the hypothesis. Some people do the opposite. They underprepare, not out of laziness, but a different calculation. If you never fully try, the result can't be a full verdict. Holding something back gives you an exit clause, I could have done better if I'd really pushed. The fraud is never confirmed if the test is never fully taken. Both strategies are exhausting. They are full-time jobs running underneath your actual full-time job, invisible to everyone around you, drawing from a reservoir you can't explain and can't replenish. The work isn't the exhausting part. The work you can do. The exhausting part is maintaining the performance of belonging while you're doing it, the constant low-grade energy spent moving through rooms like someone who isn't quietly counting down. When researchers first began mapping this pattern in the 1970s, they expected to find it concentrated in specific groups: early career professionals, people who had recently crossed a social or institutional boundary, first-generation students newly arrived in elite spaces. People who were, in some external sense, new to the room. What they found was that the room didn't matter. Experience didn't dissolve it. Seniority didn't dissolve it. In study after study, people decades into careers of genuine mastery reported the same fundamental conviction: I know enough now to be more certain I don't fully belong. That last part is worth sitting with. It wasn't that expertise failed to arrive. It was that expertise brought with it a clearer view of everything that remained unknown, and that clarity fed the very thing it was supposed to cure. Many high achievers don't grow out of this. They grow around it. They build lives of real contribution and genuine impact while quietly carrying the conviction that a more deserving version of themselves is still somewhere in transit. The feeling doesn't diminish because you succeed more. It recalibrates. It finds new language. It gets more specific. And if the system measuring you was never calibrated fairly to begin with, if the room where this started was never equipped to see you accurately, then understanding that doesn't make the feeling leave. Which raises a harder question: what does? The standard advice is to own it. Claim your space. Stand in your confidence. Repeat affirmations until they take root. You've tried. The words land like instructions written in a language your nervous system doesn't recognize. So here's a different way to hold what you're carrying. The relentless self-monitoring, the hyper-awareness of your gaps, the internal audit that never closes, these are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a mind that was trained, early and effectively, to survive in an environment where safety required constant performance. Where warmth had conditions. Where being enough was never a fixed state, only a temporary one. Your brain built a surveillance system. It watches everything. It never sleeps. It flags risk before risk fully arrives. And it has protected you, genuinely protected you, in ways you will never be able to fully count, because you cannot count the failures that never happened, the rooms you were already prepared for, the question you had already answered before it was asked. The same mechanism that whispers fraud is the mechanism that made you prepare that carefully. Check the work one more time. Ask the one extra question nobody else thought to ask. You cannot extract one without the other. Not through an insight. Not through a decision. Not overnight. Only slowly, over time, through the gradual process of learning that the room you're in now operates by different rules than the room that built you. You are not a fraud who got lucky. You are a person who was taught to distrust their own competence, and who has been quietly disproving that lesson every single day. Your brain just hasn't updated the file. Go back to that stage. That conference room. That desk the morning after. The applause landing just outside your skin. The smile held in place. The quiet countdown to discovery. Here is the thing about that moment that rarely gets said: the person standing there, running the internal audit while the room applauds, that person is almost never the one who doesn't belong. The ones who truly don't belong aren't counting down. They're not monitoring, not cataloging their own gaps with quiet forensic precision. They don't feel like frauds because they've never cared enough to ask the question. The fraud feeling, as it turns out, may be the clearest signal that you are exactly the kind of person the room needs. That doesn't make it quieter. It doesn't dissolve the memo. The memo was written a long time ago, at a table with a very specific temperature, by someone very small who was trying very hard to figure out how warmth worked. It was accurate then, in that room, with that data. It just never got the update. You've been carrying that handwriting into every room since. And the question isn't whether you can silence it. The question is whether you can start reading it differently, not as evidence of what you are, but as a record of where you've been. And what you built, quietly, in spite of it.